My name is Anna Rogers. I am 28 years old. My father, Walter Rogers, threw me out into a Texas flash flood when I was 15 because he believed I was a thief and a menace to our family. And I stood in the rising water, soaking wet, watching my sister Mackenzie smile from the dry porch while she held the very gold watch she had told him I stole. I am now a lieutenant in the United States Navy, a surface warfare officer responsible for the lives of hundreds of sailors on a destroyer patrolling the Pacific. But I have never felt as much terror as I did that night, looking back at my own front door in Austin and realizing that the man who raised me would rather see me drown than admit his favorite daughter was a liar. My mother, Evelyn Rogers, stood behind him in the shadows of the foyer, her hand on my sister's shoulder, her silence becoming the heavy anchor that finally pulled me under the surface of the only life I had ever known. I stood on that curb in Austin as the water rose past my ankles, clutching a backpack full of soaked textbooks and realizing my parents had officially erased me from their lives. If you know what it feels like to be abandoned by the people who are supposed to protect you, drop your city and state, like and subscribe. Because the car that came out of the rain 3 hours later didn't just hit me, it changed the course of my entire life. The architecture of my isolation didn't appear overnight, but was built brick by brick in a house where my sister's tears were always louder than my achievements, creating a silent vacuum where my own presence slowly began to wither. I learned early that in our Texas home, the only way to earn a seat at the table was to be the person who needed the most fixing, a role my sister perfected before she could even tie her own shoes. When I was 11 years old, I won first place at the Regional Science Fair in San Antonio, presenting a project on marine desalination systems that I had spent 6 months building in the garage. I walked through our front door clutching that blue ribbon as if it were a ticket to a world where I finally mattered. But when I shouted the news, my mother only offered a distracted smile before turning her attention back to my sister. The girl was 8 years old at the time, sobbing because she had missed a single step in her ballet recital, and my father spent the entire evening cradling her on the sofa, while my ribbon sat forgotten on the granite kitchen counter next to a half-empty bottle of Shinerbach. I stood there in the hallway, the light from the living room making me feel like a ghost, watching a family that had already decided I was surplus to their emotional requirements. By the time I reached 14, I had mastered the art of being invisible, a quiet observer of a household that revolved around the volatile weather of my sister's moods. I had already set my sights on the United States Naval Academy or a Navy ROTC scholarship, drawn to a world of order and discipline where merit was measured in objective standards rather than the shifting sands of parental favoritism. My father, a commercial real estate developer who measured success in square footage and social standing, viewed my ambitions as a quiet eccentricity, a phase that didn't quite fit the image of the Texas family he wanted to project to the neighbors in our Westlake subdivision. When I received an invitation to a prestigious summer leadership seminar at Texas A&M, I sat at the dinner table and waited for a break in the conversation, my heart hammering against my ribs with the hope that this, finally, would be the thing that made him look at me with pride. I told them about the scholarship that covered the entire cost, but before the words could fully land, my sister dropped her fork and began to cry, claiming that it wasn't fair that I got to leave for 2 weeks while she had to stay home for cheerleading camp. My mother didn't even hesitate, reaching out to stroke my sister's hair while telling me that perhaps I should skip the seminar this year for the sake of family unity, as if my future was a small price to pay to keep the peace in a house that was already at war with the truth. The lies started as small, tactical strikes designed to test the strength of the air defenses my parents had built around my sister's reputation. She would borrow my Naval Junior ROTC uniform items without asking, and when I would find them crumpled and stained in the back of her closet, she would look my mother in the eye and swear she had never touched them. My father would, telling me that I was being too rigid, that I was letting my obsession with military discipline turn me into a bully who was making my sister's life miserable. I kept thinking, if they can't trust me with the small things, they will never believe me when the big things start to break. And the breaking began with the money. $50 missing from my mother's Michael Kors wallet on a Tuesday morning in October. My sister told them she saw me near the purse before I left for school, and despite the fact that I had been at the high school track since 5 in the morning for drill team practice, my father called me into his study and told me he was disappointed in my character. He looked at me with a cold, professional detachment and told me that my Navy dreams were on hold because he couldn't trust a thief to represent the Rogers family name, let alone the United States military. The internal monologue in my head was a constant loop of survival codes, telling me to just hold on until graduation, to just survive 2 more years until I could escape to Annapolis or San Diego. I stood there thinking, if I speak the truth, they call me a liar. If I stay silent, I am a criminal. I watched my sister from the corner of my eye as she stood in the doorway, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips that vanished the moment my father turned his head back toward her. She was learning that her tears were a weapon, and she was preparing to use them for a final, devastating strike that would leave me with nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart full of Texas rainwater. The tension in the house reached a boiling point during my junior year, centered around a boy named Caleb. He was the starting quarterback for our high school football team, a typical Texas hero with a Division I future and a struggle with ad-Rogered placement physics. Because I was the top student in the class and needed the tutoring hours for my ROTC application, my instructor asked me to help him after school in the media center. It was strictly academic, a transaction of formulas and velocity vectors, but to my sister, it was a declaration of war. She had a massive, obsessive crush on him, the kind of teenage infatuation that consumes everything in its path, and she began to follow us, watching from the library stacks with a face that grew paler every day. I tried to tell her that we were just study partners, that I was only interested in my commission and my grades, but she wouldn't listen. She saw my existence as a personal insult to her own, a shadow that she had to light on fire just to feel the warmth of our parents' attention. On the Friday of the storm, the National Weather Service began issuing flash flood warnings for the Austin area, the kind of rain that turns quiet creeks into raging rivers in a matter of minutes. I had stayed late at school to finish a leadership essay, and by the time I got home, the sky was a bruised purple, and the wind was already whipping through the oak trees in our yard. The atmosphere inside the house was even darker. My sister was already on the couch, her face buried in a fleece blanket, her sobs sounding like a wounded animal. My mother was hovering over her, a glass of iced tea in one hand and a look of pure, unadulterated fury on her face as she turned to watch me walk through the door. My father was standing by the fireplace, holding a gold watch that had belonged to my grandfather, a veteran of the Korean War who was the only reason I had ever wanted to serve. He looked at the heirloom, then at me, and I felt the air leave my lungs as I realized the trap had finally snapped shut. He didn't ask me what happened. He simply told me what I had done. He accused me of stealing the watch to sell for spending money I didn't need, and when my sister had confronted me about it, he claimed I had pushed her down the stairs. My sister pulled back her sleeve to show a dark purple bruise on her forearm, a mark she must have made herself with the corner of a dresser, but in the dim light of the living room, it looked like a confession signed in blood. I tried to explain that I hadn't been home, that my drill instructor could vouch for my location, but my father slammed his hand against the mantel and told me to shut my mouth. All I could think was, he wants to believe her because it's easier than admitting he raised a monster. He looked at me with a disgust so profound it felt like a physical weight, and then he said the words that ended my childhood. "Get out of my house, Anna. I don't need a thief and a sick daughter like you poisoning this family." I looked at the rain hammering against the windows, at the floodwaters already pooling in the driveway, and I realized he wasn't just kicking me out. He was discarding me like a piece of trash he no longer had the heart to look at. The door didn't just close. It clicked with a finality that felt like a sentence being carried out, a jagged piece of metal sliding into a lock that I knew would never open for me again. I stood on that porch in Westlake for what felt like an hour, though it couldn't have been more than 60 seconds, waiting for the wood to creak, waiting for my father to realize that no matter how angry he was, you don't send a child into a Texas flash flood. But the house remained silent, a tomb of limestone and Douglas fir that had decided I was no longer part of its history. And I watched through the window as my sister reached up to adjust the thermostat, making sure the air was just right, while I was being swallowed by the dark. I turned toward the street, my Navy ROTC backpack feeling like 100 pounds of lead as the wind tried to knock me off my feet. The rain hitting my face with such force, it felt like 1,000 tiny needles. I started walking toward Lamar Boulevard, my mind a fragmented mess of survival protocols and the echo of the word sick bouncing around my skull like a bullet in a steel room. I checked my phone, the screen flickering with the desperate red of a 3% battery, and I tried to call a friend from the drill team, but the call went straight to a voicemail that I knew would never be returned in time to save me. I was a 15-year-old girl wandering the streets of Austin in a storm that was local news, my shoes squelching with every step, the water in the gutters rising until it was a rushing torrent that threatened to sweep me into the drainage pipes. I kept thinking, if I disappear tonight, they won't even have to change the locks. They've already moved on to the version of the story where I never existed. My teeth were chattering so hard I thought they might shatter. And the cold wasn't just in the air. It was a deep, tectonic shift in my bones. The realization that my parents' love had been a conditional lease that they had just decided to terminate without notice. I reached the intersection near the library, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows on the shimmering asphalt. And I remember looking at the signal, convinced it was green, convinced the world was finally giving me a path forward. The wind was howling so loud I couldn't hear the engine, and the rain was a thick, gray curtain that hid the headlights until they were inches from my hip. There was a moment of absolute, crystalline silence. The kind of silence I now experience on the bridge of a Navy destroyer right before a missile launch. And then the world exploded into white-hot noise and the smell of burning rubber. I felt my body lift off the pavement, the impact of the SUV snapping my connection to the earth as I realized my father's last words were the only thing I had left to carry into the dark. If you've ever stood at the absolute bottom of your life, wondering if anyone would even notice if you were gone, tell me what you would have done. Like and subscribe. Because the woman who stepped out of that car wasn't just a stranger. She was the person who was going to teach me that family is something you build, not something you're born into. I hit the hood of the car first, a sickening thud that knocked the wind out of my lungs. And then I was on the pavement, the cold water of the gutter rushing into my mouth and eyes as the sky spun in circles above me. I couldn't feel my legs, and there was a pressure in my head that felt like a freight train trying to push its way out through my ears. But through the haze of the rain, I heard a door slam and footsteps splashing toward me. A woman knelt in the water next to me, her hands steady and warm against my neck, her voice a calm anchor in a world that had gone completely sideways. She was Abigail Thorne, 61 years old, a dean at the University of Texas, which meant she was the highest-ranking official responsible for an entire college within the university system. And she looked at me with a horror that was quickly replaced by a professional, focused resolve. She didn't ask me why I was out there. She simply began to check my pulse, her fingers pressing against my skin with a strength that told me she wasn't going to let me drift away. "Stay with me, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice cutting through the roar of the storm like a signal flare. "I'm calling 911, and I am not leaving your side." I tried to tell her that it didn't matter, that my parents didn't want me, that I was a sick daughter who had been discarded for the crime of existing, but the words were just blood and rainwater in the back of my throat. I watched the way she shielded my face from the rain with her own coat, a wool garment that probably cost more than everything I owned, and I realized it was the first time in years that someone had put their own comfort second to my survival. The EMS arrival was a blur of red and blue lights reflecting off the Austin skyline, and the sound of a gurney clicking into place. But I remember the woman refusing to let go of my hand as they loaded me into the back of the ambulance. She followed us to Seton Medical Center, the premier hospital in the region, and she sat in that waiting room while the doctors worked to stabilize the concussion and the internal bleeding that were trying to finish what my father had started. When I finally drifted into a fractured, medicated sleep, I didn't dream of my sister's smile or the house in Westlake. I dreamed of the way the woman's hands had felt, solid, unmoving, and entirely different from the hands that had pushed me out into the rain. I woke up to the smell of antiseptic and the low hum of a heart monitor, the light in the room a soft, artificial glow that made my head throb with a dull, rhythmic pain. I could hear voices in the hallway, hushed and urgent, and I recognized the sharp, authoritative tone of my father trying to navigate a situation he couldn't control with a checkbook or a handshake. "We had a discipline issue," he was saying, his voice carrying that familiar, brittle pride that always surfaced when he was being questioned. "She ran out on her own. We had no idea she would go this far." Then I heard the woman, the one who had hit me, the one who had stayed, and her voice was a surgical blade, cold and precise. "You sent a minor out into a Category 4 storm-level event, sir. You told her she was sick and discarded her like a faulty piece of equipment." My father tried to interrupt, to claim that it was a private family matter, but the woman didn't back down. The moment that child hit the asphalt under my tires, it stopped being a private matter and became a state of Texas matter. I have already called a social worker, and I suggest you find a very good lawyer. I lay there in the dark of that hospital room, the beeping of the machines the only rhythm I had left, and I realized that for the first time in my life, someone was fighting for me without asking what I could do for them in return. My mother and my sister were somewhere in that building, probably rehearsing their own versions of the truth, but they weren't in the room with me. All I could think was, the woman who hit me is the only person who actually saw me. The 3 days that followed were a blurred sequence of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic, hollow pulse of the intravenous drip as I drifted in and out of a heavy, medicated fog in the neurology ward of Seton Medical Center. The sharp edges of the Texas storm had been replaced by the sterile quiet of the hospital, where the only constant was the presence of the woman sitting in the vinyl chair by the window. She never seemed to sleep, always silhouetted against the bright Austin sun with a book in her lap or a MacBook glowing on her knees, a silent guardian who had somehow stepped into the vacuum left by my own family. When the neurologist would come in to check my pupils or ask if I knew the year, she would stand at the foot of the bed and listen with a fierce intensity, ensuring that every detail of my recovery was being handled with the precision she demanded from her own graduate students. I kept thinking, she doesn't even know my middle name, yet she is the only person in this building who isn't looking at me like I am a problem to be solved or a secret to be buried. My parents finally appeared on the second afternoon, looking less like grieving relatives and more like people who had been inconvenienced by a citywide power outage. My mother, Evelyn, stood at the edge of the room with her arms crossed over her cashmere sweater, her eyes scanning the medical monitors with a look of profound discomfort, as if the sight of my bandaged head was a personal affront to her aesthetic sensibilities. My father, Walter, didn't even move past the doorway, his hand gripping his BlackBerry as he checked the time, his presence vibrating with the nervous energy of a man who was already calculating the cost of the insurance deductible and the damage to his social reputation. Neither of them touched me, and neither of them offered the simple, human apology that I was starving for. Instead, my mother spoke about the scare I had given them and the difficult position I had put the family in by involving the Austin Police Department. They spoke as if my concussion and the bruises flowering across my ribs were a choice I had made just to spite them, a final act of rebellion from the sick daughter who had dared to survive the night they had erased her. My sister, the girl whose lies had lit the match that burned my world down, didn't come to the hospital at all, and I learned from a hushed conversation in the hallway that she was at a high school football rally in Westlake, posing for photos and soaking in the sympathy of friends who thought her sister had simply run away during a tantrum. I stood there thinking, she is already wearing the crown of the victim, while I am still bleeding from the wound she gave me. My father eventually leaned into the room just enough to tell me that they would handle the school situation, and that I should focus on getting back on my feet so we could put this unfortunate incident behind us. But he never asked if I wanted to come home. He never said the words, "I'm sorry." And he never looked me in the eye long enough to see the girl who used to watch John Wayne movies with him on Saturday mornings. They left after 20 minutes, their footsteps echoing down the linoleum corridor with a speed that suggested they couldn't wait to breathe the air outside of my tragedy. The woman by the window waited until the door had clicked shut before she finally moved, setting her book aside and walking to the side of my bed with a look of such profound, quiet empathy that it felt more intimate than anything I had ever received from my own mother. She told me her own story then, a low-voiced confession delivered in the stillness of the ICU that changed everything I believed about the permanence of blood and bone. She had been 17 years old when her own family in East Texas had discarded her for a choice they didn't understand. And she had spent 3 months sleeping in her Chevrolet before a teacher had recognized the light in her eyes and offered her a spare room and a path to a PhD. "You are brilliant, Anna," the woman whispered, her hand finally covering mine with a warmth that felt like the first sunrise after a hurricane. "You have a mind that belongs in the Naval Academy or the Pentagon, and I will not let these people dim that light just because they are too small to see it." When the social worker from the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services arrived on the 4th day, a woman named Rita with tired eyes and a clipboard full of cold, bureaucratic realities, she sat with me and asked what I wanted to happen next. She laid out the options with a professional neutrality: returning to the house in Westlake under a supervision plan, or entering the Texas foster care system, a word that felt like a death sentence to a 15-year-old girl who had spent her life trying to be perfect. But before I could answer, the woman who had hit me with her car stepped forward and placed a folder on the table, her voice ringing with the authority of someone who had spent decades navigating the university hierarchy. She offered to become my kinship foster placement, a temporary arrangement that she was prepared to make permanent, and she showed the social worker the paperwork she had already begun with her attorney to ensure that I would have the stability I needed to finish my junior ROTC requirements. I looked at the woman, at the dean who had turned her own guilt into a shield, and I realized that my life didn't have to be a repeating cycle of my sister's lies and my father's disgust. I looked at the social worker and made the only decision that made sense in a world that had tried to drown me. I chose something different. 6 months later, I was living in a quiet, mid-century modern house in the Mueller district of Austin, a place filled with leather-bound books and the smell of freshly roasted coffee. The woman, Abigail, had given me the guest suite and told me I could paint the walls whatever color I wanted. But more importantly, she gave me the safety I needed to actually breathe. I had transferred to a different high school where no one knew about the sick daughter, and I threw myself into my studies with a ferocity that was no longer about earning my father's love, but about proving my own worth to the woman who had bet her life on mine. I watched her at the dinner table, a woman who had built an entire career out of policy research, and I realized that she was teaching me a different kind of leadership, one that wasn't about the chain of command, but about the responsibility we have to the people who fall through the cracks of the systems we build. I heard through old acquaintances that my parents had removed every trace of me from the house in Westlake, replacing my swim team trophies with my sister's pageant sashes, and telling anyone who asked that I was attending a private boarding school for my health. They had erased me from the Christmas cards and the family portraits, but it didn't hurt the way I thought it would. Instead, it felt like a security clearance being granted, a final separation from a world that had never truly been mine. I was no longer the girl who was discarded in the rain. I was the girl who was learning how to lead, how to navigate the Pacific Ocean with a star chart, and how to build a family out of the people who actually show up when the storm surge hits. The transition from a discarded daughter in Westlake to a midshipman candidate was not a journey of miles, but a grueling tactical ad Rogers through the wreckage of my own reputation. Abigail didn't just provide a roof in the Mueller district. She provided an armory of intellectual and legal resources, helping me navigate the Texas court system to secure my independence while I spent my nights buried in calculus and physics textbooks. I had already set my sights on a Navy ROTC scholarship at the University of Texas at Austin, a path that would lead to a commission as an officer and a life far away from the limestone mansions and the whispered lies of my sister. I was 18 years old, standing on the threshold of the life I had built from the scraps of the one they threw away. But the ghost of that Texas storm was not finished with me yet. When the time came for my formal interview with the Navy Scholarship Board at Joint Base San Antonio, the commander looked at my file with a frown that made my blood turn to ice. He pulled out a letter, yellowed and creased, that had been sent to my junior ROTC unit 3 years prior. A formal notification signed by my father, Walter Rogers, accusing me of grand larceny and unstable psychological behavior. My father hadn't just thrown me out into the rain. He had attempted to launch a preemptive strike against the only future he knew I wanted, signing his name to a document designed to ensure that no military branch would ever trust me with a commission. All I could think was, he didn't just want me gone. He wanted me destroyed. A scorched earth policy applied to his own flesh and blood to protect the image of the daughter who stayed. I sat in that sterile office in San Antonio, the smell of industrial floor wax and starched uniforms thick in the air, and I realized that my sister's lies had been weaponized by a man who understood exactly how to use a paperwork trail as a garrote. I had to stand before a board of commissioned officers and explain why my own father considered me a criminal. My voice steady only because Abigail had spent months teaching me that the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. I stood in that office in San Antonio and looked at the signature of the man who had tried to bury my career before it even began, realizing that the only way to survive was to become the person he was most afraid I would be. If you've ever had someone you love try to sabotage your future out of pure malice, tell me what you would have done. Like and subscribe. Because the realization that my mother had stood by and watched him sign that letter was the moment I finally stopped waiting for them to come find me. The board eventually saw through the spite, thanks in no part to a character reference from Abigail and the Austin Police Department records from the night of the accident, and I was granted my scholarship. But the victory felt heavy with the scent of ozone and betrayal. I spent the next 4 years in Austin as a midshipman, my life a disciplined rotation of morning colors, naval science labs, and late-night study sessions that left no room for the sick daughter to resurface. I became a battalion commander, leading hundreds of other students with a quiet Texan resolve that I had forged in the rising waters of Lamar Boulevard. And when I finally stood on that stage to receive my commission as an ensign in the United States Navy, Abigail was the one who pinned the gold bars on my shoulders. My parents were not invited, and my sister was a distant, filtered image on Instagram, celebrating her own Greek life successes at a university on the other side of the state, while I was swearing an oath to support and defend a constitution that they had treated like a suggestion. It was during my first deployment as a surface warfare officer on a destroyer in the Western Pacific that I learned the full extent of the erasure my father had engineered in my absence. I had left my old Ford F-150, the truck I had bought with 3 years of lawn mowing money and H-E-B grocery store shifts, parked in their garage, thinking that even in their hatred, they wouldn't touch the only property I had ever truly owned. But when I returned to Texas for a brief leave before my next rotation, I discovered that my mother, Evelyn, had used the power of attorney I hadn't yet revoked to sell the truck to a used car lot in Round Rock. They hadn't needed the money. They had simply wanted to remove the last physical reminder that I had ever occupied a square inch of their lives. I learned from a cousin that the proceeds from the sale had gone toward my sister's graduation trip to Europe, a final sickening irony that felt like a torpedo hitting me below the waterline. I stood in the driveway of that house in Westlake, a commissioned officer in the United States Navy with a Sea Service ribbon on my chest, and I looked at the empty space in the garage where my life used to be. I didn't knock on the door, and I didn't call my father to demand an explanation for the theft. I simply walked away, the Texas heat shimmering off the pavement like a fading memory. I realized then that they weren't just toxic. They were a biohazard to my soul. A family that viewed my success as a threat to the narrative they had constructed to justify their own cruelty. I went back to Abigail's house, the place that had become my true home port, and we sat on the back deck with a bottle of Texas Hill Country wine, watching the stars come out over the Mueller district. I told her then that I wanted to start something, a foundation, a scholarship program for kids who had been discarded by the very people who were supposed to be their navigation lights. I wanted to call it the Second Chance Foundation, and I wanted it to be the legacy that replaced the Rogers name in my heart. By the time I was 27, I had been promoted to lieutenant, serving as the operations officer on a destroyer out of San Diego, responsible for the complex tactical maneuvers and weapon systems of a billion-dollar warship. My life was measured in nautical miles and radar contacts, a world of absolute clarity where your performance mattered more than your pedigree. I had built a reputation in the Pacific Fleet as an officer who took care of her sailors, a leader who looked for the sick ones, the ones the system wanted to discard, and gave them the tools to fix themselves. But as I prepared for my final year of active duty before transitioning to the Naval Reserve to run my foundation full-time, an invitation arrived in my military email that forced me to look back at the shore I had left behind. The president of Riverside State University, the school where my sister was finishing her degree, wanted me to be the keynote speaker at their spring commencement. They didn't know I was the daughter who had been thrown out in the rain. They only knew me as Lieutenant Anna Rogers, the founder of a scholarship program that was changing the lives of hundreds of Texas students. All I could think was, the storm is coming back, but this time, I'm the one bringing the thunder. The invitation sat on the mahogany desk of my office in San Diego, a piece of heavy cream-colored cardstock embossed with the seal of Riverside State University that felt like a summons to a past I had spent 13 years trying to outrun. I sat there in my khaki service uniform, the air conditioner humming a sterile, rhythmic tune that reminded me of the ventilation systems on a destroyer, and I looked at the name printed beneath the title of keynote speaker, Lieutenant Anna Rogers, United States Navy. They had no idea that the distinguished alumna they were courting was the same girl who had been erased from the local Texas census records by a father who couldn't bear the sight of his own failure. I reached for my glass of unsweetened tea, the ice clinking against the glass like a warning bell, and I realized that the president of the university was inviting me to stand center stage in the very city where I had been left for dead. I kept thinking, the universe isn't just giving me a podium, it's giving me a firing solution. And for the first time in my life, I have the clearance to take the shot. I flew back to Austin 2 weeks before the ceremony, staying in the same house in the Mueller district where Abigail had helped me rebuild my life from the asphalt up. We sat in her kitchen, the evening air thick with the scent of Texas jasmine and the distant sound of a neighbor's barbecue, and she watched me as I drafted my speech on a yellow legal pad. She was the one who had seen me through the concussions, the nightmares, and the grueling years of Navy training. And she knew that my silence wasn't a lack of emotion, but the disciplined restraint of a surface warfare officer preparing for a tactical engagement. She poured me a cup of dark roast coffee and told me that I didn't owe them a performance, that I could simply tell my story and let the truth do the work that anger never could. "You are not the victim anymore, Anna," she said, her voice a calm, steady navigation light in the dark. "You are the commander of your own narrative now, and they are just spectators in a life they no longer have the right to claim." I spent my afternoons in Austin visiting the satellite offices of the Second Chance Foundation, checking on the scholarship recipients who were studying at the University of Texas and St. Edwards, seeing my own reflection in the eyes of 19-year-olds who had been told they were broken or too much to handle. I would take them out for brisket tacos at a local food truck and listen to their stories. And every time I heard about a parent who had walked away or a sibling who had lied, I felt the armor around my heart grow a little thicker. I was building a fleet of survivors, a task force of students who were proving that the Texas sun still shines on the people the world tries to shade. I didn't tell them I was speaking at my sister's graduation. I didn't tell them that the girl who was about to walk across that stage was the primary architect of my own destruction. I simply told them to keep their heads up and their charts clear, because the only person who can truly sink you is the one you allow to take the helm. One night, driven by a morbid, tactical curiosity, I opened my laptop and looked at my sister's social media profile for the first time in years. It was a masterpiece of curated Texas perfection, a digital gallery of brunch photos, football games, and carefully staged, candid shots of a life that appeared to be entirely free of conflict. She had posted a photo of her graduation gown hanging in the foyer of the house in Westlake, with a caption about being blessed to have the most supportive parents in the world. There were no photos of me, no mentions of an older sister who was currently serving her country, and no hint that her perfect family was built on a foundation of abandonment and fraud. I saw a photo of my mother and father at a country club dinner, my father's hair grayer at the temples, but his posture still radiating that rigid, commercial real estate arrogance that had once made me feel so small. They looked happy, or at least they looked like people who had successfully convinced themselves that the sick daughter had never existed at all. I stood there thinking, they've spent 13 years living a lie, and I'm about to turn the lights on. I wrote my speech in the quiet hours of the morning, my Navy precision guiding every word, every pause, and every revelation until it was a symphony of factual, devastating honesty. I didn't use names, and I didn't call for revenge. I simply told the story of a 15-year-old girl, a flash flood, and the accidental ally who had saved her when her own blood had turned to ice. I practiced the delivery in front of the mirror, watching my own reflection. The lieutenant in the Navy, the woman in the pearl necklace, the leader of a foundation. And I realized that I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I was the one with the commission. I was the one with the legacy. And I was the one who was about to show them that the girl they threw away had become the woman they could never hope to be. When the morning of the ceremony arrived, the Texas sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue, and as I pulled on my navy dress whites, I felt a peace so profound it was almost cold. I wasn't going to that auditorium to scream. I was going there to finish the mission. The Riverside State University Auditorium was a cavernous space of glass and steel, vibrating with the nervous, high-frequency energy of 2,000 people and the oppressive, pre-noon Texas heat that even the industrial HVAC system couldn't quite conquer. Backstage, the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the heavy polyester of graduation gowns, a world of controlled chaos where faculty members adjusted their academic hoods and staff checked teleprompters with a frantic, rhythmic precision. I stood in the wings, my navy dress whites a sharp, blinding contrast to the dark robes around me, and I reached up to touch the surface warfare officer pin on my chest, the cold metal a grounding wire for the storm that was about to break. The university president touched my elbow, his voice warm and oblivious as he told me how honored they were to have a local hero like Lieutenant Rogers as their speaker. And I simply nodded, my mind locked on the seating chart I had memorized that morning. Row 8, center section. The 3 people who had spent 13 years pretending I had drowned in a flash flood. When the processional music began, the familiar, somber chords of pomp and circumstance, I watched through the curtain as the sea of caps and gowns flooded into the arena, a wave of black and gold that represented the future of a state I had fought for, but never felt welcome in. I saw my sister Mackenzie walking toward the 3rd row, her smile as bright and curated as it was on her social media feed, her hands adjusting her honor cords with a pride that made my jaw tighten. And then I saw them, my father, Walter, and my mother, Evelyn, sitting in the middle of the 8th row, their faces radiating the smug, satisfied glow of parents whose only good child was about to cross the finish line. They were clapping, their hands coming together in a rhythmic, hollow sound that I hadn't heard since I was 15. And I realized they were looking at the podium with an eager anticipation, entirely unaware that the name on the program was the one they had tried to erase from the Texas history books. I stood at that podium in my navy dress whites, looking directly into the eyes of the sister who had erased me from her life 13 years ago, while the room went so quiet you could hear the Texas wind outside. If you think you know which folder I handed to the university president after I finished my speech, drop a yes or no in the comments, like and subscribe. Because the look on my father's face when he realized who I was is something I will never forget for the rest of my life. The university president stepped to the microphone, his voice booming across the speakers as he introduced the distinguished lieutenant and the founder of the Second Chance Foundation. And as I stepped into the light, I felt the air in the room shift. My heels clicked against the hardwood stage with the steady, measured pace of a watch officer on the bridge of a destroyer. And as I reached the podium, I adjusted the microphone with a hand that didn't tremble. I looked out over the crowd, and for a heartbeat, the world stopped. I saw my sister's face go white, her hands freezing mid-clap as the recognition hit her like a high-velocity projectile. Behind her, in the 8th row, I saw my father lean forward, his eyes squinting as he tried to reconcile the woman in the Navy uniform with the girl he had abandoned on a curb in Austin. My mother's hand went to her throat, a reflexive, panicked gesture that told me the erasure had finally failed, and I felt a cold, crystalline clarity settle over me. "Good morning, graduates, families, and Riverside State faculty," I said, my voice amplified and steady, echoing off the steel rafters like a command. I began with the statistics, the thousands of students in Texas who fall through the cracks of the foster system and the families who fail them, before I pivoted to the story I had come to tell. I spoke about a 15-year-old girl, a Category 4 storm, and a father who had called his own child sick before pushing her into the rising waters of a flash flood. I described the feeling of the asphalt hitting her skull and the sight of a sister smiling from a dry porch, and as I spoke, The silence in the auditorium became a physical weight, a heavy, suffocating blanket that made every breath feel like a struggle. I saw my father's head drop into his hands, his shoulders shaking with a grief or a shame that I no longer cared to categorize. And I saw my sister staring at her lap, her blessed life crumbling in the span of a single paragraph. I learned that night that blood doesn't make you family. Choice does, I continued, my eyes locked on the front row where Abigail sat, her eyes bright with a pride that my biological mother had never earned. I told them about the Navy, about the Pacific Fleet, and about the Second Chance Foundation that was now providing over $200,000 in scholarships to the kids who had been discarded, just like I was. I looked directly at my sister, making eye contact across the space of 3 rows, and I told the graduating class that their worth wasn't determined by the people who left them behind, but by the life they built in the aftermath. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry. I simply spoke the truth in a room full of people who had been lied to for 13 years. And as the applause began to build, a slow, thunderous roar that shook the very foundations of the building, I realized that the mission wasn't just about my own peace. It was about making sure that in this house of Texas academia, the truth was the only thing left standing. I walked off that stage with the steady, rhythmic gait of a woman who had finally cleared her own navigation channel, the roar of the crowd fading into a quiet, focused hum as I met my mentor in the reception area. She didn't say a word. She simply hugged me with a strength that told me the 14 years of silence were finally over. I saw them one last time at the side entrance of the auditorium. My father, my mother, and the sister who had buried me in her lies, standing by a limestone pillar like ruins of a life I no longer occupied. My father's mouth opened as if he wanted to offer a commissioned officer a reason for his cowardice, and my sister reached out a hand that I didn't take, her eyes red with a desperation that the Texas sun couldn't burn away. I didn't feel the heat of anger or the cold of resentment. I simply felt the absolute, unmoving weight of the truth. I stood there thinking, I spent a decade wanting them to look at me. But now that they finally are, I realized I'm the only one in this driveway who is actually free. I turned my back on the house in Westlake and the people who lived inside its shadows, walking toward a future that didn't require their permission to exist. My sister, Mackenzie, watched her carefully constructed digital world evaporate within 48 hours, losing the PR position she had coveted and the Alpha Phi social circle that couldn't reconcile her only child lies with the reality of the woman in the Navy uniform. My father, Walter, was forced to resign from the Westlake board as the local Austin community began to question the character of a man who would leave his daughter in a flash flood. And my mother's insurance business suffered a loss of reputation that she could never quite recover from. I am now a senior director at the Second Chance Foundation, and we have awarded over $500,000 in scholarships to Texas students who were left behind by the systems that should have protected them. I have a home in the Mueller district that is filled with books and laughter, and I have a mother in Abigail who has shown up for every promotion ceremony for 13 years. They spent 13 years protecting a lie that eventually collapsed under the weight of the truth. I spent those same years building a life that doesn't need a single lie to survive. I realized that I never actually needed them to believe me. I only needed to believe in the woman I was capable of becoming. I drive my Jeep to the office every morning now in a city that finally feels like home. And when I pass that old turnoff for Westlake, I don't even slow down. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like and subscribe. Because there is always someone sitting in their car right now trying to figure out how to survive the storm.